One God, many interpretations, and millions of victims. What if the deadliest force in human history wasn't war, greed, or empire, but the interpretation of God? What if billions of people believed in the same creator, yet killed each other simply because they understood him differently? This is the story of how one God became 1,000 doctrines, and how those doctrines shaped centuries of violence, identity, and power. For thousands of years, humanity has prayed to one God under countless names: Yahweh, Allah, the Father, the Almighty. Yet the belief in a single divine source has never united the world. Instead, it has fragmented civilizations, fueled holy wars, legitimized empires, and created enemies out of neighbors. The tragedy is not that people worship differently, but that interpretations of God became political weapons long before they became spiritual pathways. Three major traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, trace their origins to the same God of Abraham. Yet each one developed its own doctrines, laws, and visions of divine truth. Over centuries, these interpretations were shaped not only by prophets and scriptures, but by kings, sultans, popes, empires, revolutions, and modern nation-states. Faith became inseparable from politics, theology became inseparable from identity, and interpretation became inseparable from power. When interpretations hardened into dogma, disagreement became heresy. When dogma fused with political authority, heresy became treason. And when treason met fear, entire populations were slaughtered in the name of God. The victims of these conflicts, millions across continents and centuries, rarely died for theology. They died for the ambitions of those who claimed the right to define God. This video reveals how one divine source fractured into competing interpretations that shaped the world's bloodiest centuries. It exposes the political machinery behind religious authority, the psychological vulnerabilities that made populations obedient, and the tragic consequences of confusing human interpretation with divine will. By the end, you may realize that the question was never, which religion is right? The real question is, how did one God become so many ideologies? 1. The birth of interpretation. How one God became many voices. The story of one God should have united humanity. Instead, it birthed some of the deepest divisions the world has ever seen. But these divisions did not emerge because God changed. He did not. They emerged because human beings interpreted him through their own cultures, fears, and political realities. The birth of interpretation was not a spiritual event. It was a human event. And from that moment, every revelation became a battlefield of meanings. In the ancient world, belief in one supreme God did not appear in a vacuum. It arose inside societies shaped by trauma, slavery in Egypt, exile in Babylon, occupation by empires, tribal wars, economic hardship, and the psychological burden of survival. When the early Israelites embraced monotheism, they interpreted God as a deliverer, a protector who intervenes in history, liberates the oppressed, and demands justice. This was not only theology, it was identity. A persecuted people needed a God who guaranteed survival. Their understanding of the divine became inseparable from their struggle for existence. But as their community evolved, so did their interpretations. Priests emphasized ritual purity. Prophets emphasized ethics and mercy. Kings emphasized authority and national destiny. Scribes preserved the law. Every group projected its own priorities onto the same God. And so, even within Judaism itself, the first fractures of interpretation began. Fractures not of belief in God, but of what he asks, what he values, and how he should be served. Centuries later, Christianity emerged from the same soil, but offered a fundamentally different lens. Jesus of Nazareth preached a God of radical compassion, one who preferred the poor over the powerful, forgiveness over vengeance, and inner transformation over external ritual. Yet the interpretation of Jesus changed dramatically once his message left its Jewish context and entered the Greco-Roman world. Greek philosophy asked metaphysical questions. Is Jesus divine? Is he human? How does salvation work? Roman political structures demanded hierarchy and uniformity. These pressures turned a message of relational spirituality into a system of doctrines, councils, and creeds. Christianity's interpretation of God expanded beyond moral teachings into metaphysical debates, each shaped by cultural assumptions alien to the original context. Then came Islam, entering a world already divided by competing interpretations of monotheism. Muhammad's message aimed not to start a new religion, but to restore a pure understanding of God's unity, stripped of distortions, conflicts, and institutional corruption. Yet once Islam expanded beyond Arabia into Persia, Africa, Byzantium, and Central Asia, it absorbed philosophical, political, and cultural influences from every region it touched. The Quran's clarity met the world's complexity. Schools of law formed, sects emerged, mystical traditions blossomed. Political dynasties championed interpretations that reinforced their legitimacy. Islam, too, developed multiple internal voices, each claiming to express the true will of God. Across the Abrahamic traditions, one pattern repeated. The moment a revelation entered human society, it was shaped by human context. Interpretation was unavoidable. Every reader of Scripture brings their own history, trauma, worldview, and desires. Every community adapts divine commandments to its own social structures. Every empire reforms theology to maintain control. And so, one God did not become many because he changed, but because humans changed him in their minds. Interpretation became identity. Identity became doctrine. Doctrine became boundaries. Boundaries became conflicts. This transformation was so subtle, so gradual, that most believers never noticed it happening. They inherited doctrines without realizing they were interpretations. They inherited interpretations without realizing they were shaped by politics. They inherited politics without realizing they had drifted far from the original revelation. The tragedy began not when religions disagreed, but when those disagreements hardened into absolute truths. When a community believed its interpretation was not merely right, but divinely mandated. When it believed all others were not simply mistaken, but dangerous. Interpretation then became a weapon. And once interpretation turned into weaponry, the stage was set for centuries of war. But before those wars erupted, something else happened, something even more consequential. The interpretations that began as spiritual insights were soon seized, amplified, and weaponized by rulers who understood that controlling the meaning of God meant controlling the people of God. That next chapter, the transformation of interpretation into political power, is where the bloodshed truly begins. 2. Doctrines as weapons, empires, holy wars, and the politics of divine truth. When interpretations hardened into doctrines, something irreversible happened to human spirituality. What had once been fluid, mysterious, and deeply personal turned into rigid structures that demanded loyalty. Doctrine, at its best, was meant to protect truth from corruption. At its worst, it became the ultimate instrument of domination. For empires, kingdoms, and institutions, controlling doctrine meant controlling identity, obedience, and destiny. And so began one of the most consequential transformations in human history, the elevation of belief into a tool of empire. The ancient world already understood the power of sacred language. Pharaohs claimed divine birth. Emperors claimed the mandate of heaven. Kings claimed the favor of gods. But monotheism, belief in one single, absolute divine source, magnified this power exponentially. If God was one, then truth was one. And if truth was one, whoever controlled the interpretation of that truth controlled the moral universe itself. No king, no emperor, no general could ask for greater authority. In Jewish history, doctrine emerged as a safeguard for survival. The Torah preserved identity through exile, persecution, and displacement. But as interpretations multiplied, so did debates over purity, law, and legitimacy. The Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and Zealots all read the same scriptures, yet lived out completely different religious realities. Each group believed it held the authentic interpretation of God's will. Their disagreements were not merely theological, they were political. Under Roman occupation, doctrine became resistance for some, accommodation for others, and a weapon for those who sought to preserve cultural memory. For the first time in recorded Abrahamic history, interpretation was tied directly to questions of life, death, and loyalty in a world dominated by imperial power. Christianity inherited this dynamic, but magnified it far beyond anything the ancient Jewish world had ever imagined. When Christianity spread through the Roman Empire, it encountered a state with unprecedented administrative capacity and a hunger for ideological unity. Rome understood that controlling the interpretation of divine truth would strengthen imperial cohesion. When Constantine converted to Christianity, doctrine transformed from a spiritual debate into an imperial mandate. The early councils, Nicaea, Chalcedon, Constantinople, were not merely theological gatherings, they were political battlegrounds disguised as spiritual forums. Emperors chose which bishops to support. Bishops jockeyed for influence over imperial favor. Councils that defined the nature of Christ, the Trinity, and salvation were shaped by political threats, regional rivalries, and imperial agendas. The outcome of a doctrine could determine the loyalty of entire provinces, the stability of borders, and the legitimacy of rulers. This dynamic became even more pronounced when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. Dissenting interpretations, once tolerated as theological discussions, were rebranded as heresy, a word that carried not intellectual disagreement, but political danger. To question doctrine was to question imperial unity. To dissent was to threaten the social order. And so heretics were punished not as misguided believers, but as enemies of the state. In this atmosphere, the teachings of Jesus about compassion, humility, and mercy were overshadowed by the institutional need for order, obedience, and conformity. Doctrine ceased to be a path toward truth and became a boundary that separated the loyal from the dangerous. Islam, too, underwent a similar transformation as its spiritual message expanded into political reality. In its earliest years, Islam emphasized justice, unity, and ethical monotheism. The Quran condemned coercion, warned against arrogance, and encouraged believers to reflect deeply rather than follow blindly. But after the death of the Prophet, leadership disputes created the first great Islamic schism, Sunni and Shia, rooted not only in theological difference, but in political succession. The question of who had the authority to interpret divine revelation became a struggle for legitimacy, fought with swords as much as with scripture. As Islamic empires expanded under the Umayyads, Abbasids, Fatimids, Ottomans, Safavids, and Mughals, doctrinal authority became inseparable from political power. Scholars who aligned with rulers gained influence. Those who opposed authority were silenced. Schools of Islamic jurisprudence flourished, producing brilliant legal and philosophical traditions. But beneath their intellectual sophistication lay a simple truth. Interpretation reflected power relationships as much as spiritual insight. Rulers embraced doctrines that reinforced their authority and suppressed those that challenged their rule. As in Christian history, doctrine became a structure of governance. Interpretation, once fluid, became codified. Codification became law. Law became empire. And once empire wrapped itself in divine authority, dissent became rebellion, not only against the state, but against God himself. This fusion of doctrine with political power created fertile ground for holy wars. When a ruler believed or declared that his interpretation of God was not merely correct, but divinely mandated, violence became righteous. When empires fought, they claimed they were defending faith, truth, and divine order. But in reality, they fought for land, wealth, influence, and prestige. Doctrine served as a weaponized narrative, allowing rulers to mask political goals in sacred language. The Crusades stand as a stark example of this dynamic. When Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade, he did so by framing a political problem: the Byzantine Empire's declining ability to defend itself from Muslim armies, as a spiritual emergency. He promised forgiveness of sins to anyone who took up the cross. He declared that liberating the Holy Land was the will of God, despite the fact that Jesus himself never once commanded military action. The Crusades were fueled by doctrine that had been reshaped into political propaganda. Crusaders marched believing they were fighting for salvation, but the wars they waged devastated cities, destroyed cultures, and hardened religious divisions for centuries. In the Islamic world, similar holy narratives appeared. As caliphates expanded, rulers used the language of jihad to justify conquests. While the Quran clearly limited warfare to defense and ethical conduct, political leaders broadened the concept into a mandate for imperial ambition. Although many scholars resisted these distortions, empires sought legitimacy, not theological purity. And so, holy wars were not the inevitable outcome of Islamic teaching. They were the result of imperial strategies wrapped in sacred rhetoric. Even Judaism, though historically less politically dominant, was not immune to doctrinal weaponization. Under foreign rule, interpretations of law became acts of resistance or collaboration. Zealots used divine law to justify revolt. Pharisees used it to negotiate survival. Essenes used it to retreat from a corrupt world. Each group used doctrine to define who was faithful and who was a traitor, even as they all worshiped the same God. Across the Abrahamic world, doctrine evolved into a battlefield, not because religions demanded war, but because rulers found war easier to wage when framed as divine obligation. Soldiers fought harder when convinced their cause was holy. Populations submitted more readily when told obedience was the will of God. Dissent collapsed under the weight of fear, shame, and accusations of heresy. Entire societies were structured around sacred narratives designed to reinforce political control. Throughout medieval and early modern history, doctrinal conflicts continued to shape violence. The Inquisition targeted those who deviated from Catholic orthodoxy, often for political reasons disguised as spiritual concerns. Protestant and Catholic armies slaughtered each other across Europe during the Reformation. Orthodox and Catholic factions clashed over authority as much as theology. Muslim empires fought Sunni-Shia wars that were driven more by dynastic rivalry than by doctrinal significance. Jews suffered massacres based on Christian doctrines that portrayed them as rejected by God. Interpretations deliberately crafted to consolidate Christian identity and justify exclusion. Doctrines became boundaries of belonging. They defined citizenship, loyalty, and moral worth. They separated the saved from the damned, the pure from the impure, the righteous from the enemy. Entire generations grew up believing that their community alone understood God correctly, and that all others were mistaken, dangerous, or evil. The tragedy is that the vast majority of believers in these conflicts never understood the political machinery behind their doctrines. They inherited interpretations without seeing the history behind them. They trusted authorities without realizing those authorities were shaped by political necessity. They fought wars believing they defended God, when in reality they defended interpretations crafted by institutions seeking power. Doctrines did not become weapons by accident. They became weapons because rulers discovered that nothing motivates human beings more powerfully than the belief that they are fighting for divine truth. When political ambition is framed as spiritual obligation, people will sacrifice everything: wealth, freedom, even their lives. And when entire societies believe that God sanctions violence, the atrocities that follow can be justified as sacred duty. This is the story of how interpretation turned into doctrine, doctrine into structure, structure into empire, and empire into bloodshed. The spiritual heart of monotheism, its call to justice, mercy, and humility, was overshadowed by institutional demands for loyalty, control, and domination. And yet, the story does not end here. The modern world would take these ancient patterns and reinvent them through propaganda, nationalism, technology, and ideological warfare. The lies would become more refined, the manipulation more psychological, and the battlefield more global. To understand the full cost of doctrinal weaponization, we must enter the modern age, where faith was not only shaped by power, but industrialized by nations, political movements, and global media. 3. The modern fragmentation, nations, ideologies, and the global marketplace of God. When the world crossed the threshold into the modern age, the ancient fusion of faith and power did not disappear, it evolved. The collapse of medieval empires, the rise of nation-states, the birth of modern ideologies, and the explosion of global communication shattered old religious structures and replaced them with something far more diffuse, far more volatile, and far more difficult to control. Religion, once contained within churches, mosques, and synagogues, escaped into the bloodstream of modern identity. It became a tool, a commodity, a political currency, and a psychological battlefield. It fragmented not because belief diminished, but because the world around belief shifted too rapidly for traditional structures to keep up. At the dawn of modernity, Europe became the epicenter of this transformation. The Protestant Reformation shattered institutional unity, and the printing press democratized theological authority. Suddenly, every believer could read scripture, form opinions, and challenge institutions. But this freedom came at a cost. The rise of countless interpretations competing for influence. The wars of religion that scarred Europe for centuries forced states to rethink the relationship between church and crown. Slowly, religion ceased to be the official platform of political power and instead became one voice among many. But the vacuum left behind was quickly filled by something new: nationalism. Nationalism became the modern world's new theology, offering its own mythic origins, chosen people, sacred lands, and moral narratives. Flags became symbols of identity, borders became holy lines, patriotism became liturgy. Political leaders were no longer divine representatives, but they wielded divine-like authority by embodying the will of the nation. Nations spoke the language of destiny, sacrifice, and collective righteousness, the same emotional grammar once used by religious institutions. For the first time in history, populations were mobilized not by faith in God, but by faith in country. Yet this nationalism did not displace religion. It grafted itself onto religion, creating hybrid identities that were far more potent than either alone. In Catholic Europe, the Church struggled to maintain authority in a world increasingly dominated by secular states. In Protestant regions, the fragmentation continued as theological diversity expanded into denominational proliferation. Lutherans, Calvinists, Anglicans, Baptists, Methodists, Evangelicals, and countless independent churches. Each one claimed to embody the true spirit of Christianity, yet each one reflected the cultural, political, and psychological environment of its time. Christianity became less a unified tradition and more a vast marketplace of interpretations, shaped as much by social pressures as by scripture. In the Orthodox world, the fall of Byzantium and the rise of the Ottoman Empire placed the Eastern Church under foreign rule. Religion became a symbol of cultural survival rather than imperial ambition. When the Russian Empire later embraced orthodoxy as a tool of state identity, the Church once again became intertwined with political power, but in a different form. Instead of universal empire, orthodoxy was now bound to national destiny. Russian Orthodoxy, Greek Orthodoxy, Serbian Orthodoxy, Romanian Orthodoxy. Each tradition developed within specific political and cultural contexts, turning a once unified theological tradition into a constellation of national churches shaped by local history and geopolitical pressure. Islam faced its own form of fragmentation. After centuries of powerful caliphates, the modern era brought colonialism, European imperial intervention, and the dismembering of Islamic political structures. The fall of the Ottoman Empire in 1924 was the most symbolic rupture, ending the last major institution capable of claiming universal authority in the Islamic world. This void gave rise to competing visions of Islamic identity: traditionalists, reformists, modernists, Sufis, Salafis, Shia revivals, and later political Islam movements like the Muslim Brotherhood, Jamaat-e-Islami, the Iranian Revolution, and various jihadist groups. Each claimed to restore the true Islam, yet each reflected unique political and social pressures. Islam, like Christianity before it, entered the modern marketplace of interpretation. Meanwhile, Judaism underwent one of the most dramatic transformations of all. Centuries of exile, persecution, and diaspora life had turned Judaism into a religion defined by resilience and legal tradition. But the modern world introduced new ideological currents that reshaped Jewish identity: emancipation, secularism, socialism, Zionism, and the trauma of the Holocaust. Zionism, originally a secular nationalist movement, eventually fused with religious identity, especially after the founding of the State of Israel. The result was another layer of fragmentation: religious Zionists, secular Zionists, Haredi Jews, progressive Jews, American Reform Jews, and numerous sub-communities with conflicting visions of what Judaism means in the modern age. Once again, one God became many voices, this time amplified by trauma, statehood, and global geopolitics. A new force accelerated this fragmentation even further: modern ideologies. Liberalism, socialism, fascism, capitalism, communism, and later globalism and identity politics all competed with religion by offering alternative frameworks for meaning, belonging, and moral order. Some replaced religion outright, others hybridized with it, creating new syncretic identities. In many societies, religious symbols were appropriated to serve secular ideologies. Totalitarian regimes like the Soviet Union and Maoist China built quasi-religious systems complete with sacred texts, prophets, rituals, and moral absolutes. Yet they removed God from the equation. These states were not atheist in the traditional sense. They were theological in structure, but secular in content. The result was yet another layer of fragmentation: religion without God, spirituality without transcendence, ideology masquerading as faith. As the world entered the 20th and 21st centuries, technological progress reshaped the battlefield of belief. Mass media transformed religion into spectacle. Television evangelists, political preachers, and charismatic leaders built followings larger than ancient prophets could ever imagine. Nations discovered how to weaponize religious identity through propaganda, crafting narratives of fear, threat, and destiny to mobilize populations. Extremist groups exploited grievances, using digital platforms to spread radical interpretations globally in seconds. The internet shattered every remaining barrier, turning religion into an open marketplace where anyone could claim authority. A YouTube preacher could reach more followers than traditional religious institutions. A single viral video could reshape theological debate. Belief became decentralized, democratized, and destabilized. The result was a world where religious identity was no longer governed by councils, institutions, or scriptures, but by algorithmic visibility and emotional resonance. People no longer inherited belief, they consumed it. They pieced together spiritual identities from fragments: Sufi poetry, evangelical sermons, New Age meditation, political ideology, nationalist mythology, self-help psychology, conspiracy theories, and personal emotion. God became a customizable concept, interpreted according to individual desire rather than communal tradition. Faith became fluid. Spiritual authority dissolved. The notion of truth fragmented into countless interpretations. Yet fragmentation did not weaken religion. It intensified it. When institutions no longer controlled meaning, people sought deeper emotional certainty. When theology became pluralistic, identity became more tribal. When traditional authorities lost credibility, believers gravitated toward charismatic voices promising purity, authenticity, and clarity. This combination created fertile ground for radicalization. Extremism thrived not because religion became stronger, but because traditional structures of interpretation became weaker. Fragmentation also fueled political polarization. Leaders in the modern world discovered that religious identity still possessed enormous power, especially when combined with nationalist or ideological narratives. In the United States, evangelical Christianity fused with conservative politics, shaping elections, foreign policy, and cultural divides. In the Middle East, Sunni and Shia identities became political tools exploited by regional powers. In India, Hindu nationalism weaponized ancient myths to justify modern exclusion. In Russia, Orthodox Christianity became a symbol of national destiny used to justify geopolitical aggression. Everywhere, religious interpretation became a resource for political manipulation. This modern fragmentation did not produce merely diversity, it produced competition. Each interpretation competed for followers, legitimacy, and power. The same God became a symbol for entirely contradictory agendas. And in this global marketplace of God, truth became impossible to centralize. Every voice claimed authority. Every group claimed authenticity. Every interpretation claimed divine approval. But the most profound transformation was psychological. The modern human lives in a world of existential uncertainty. Traditional communities have weakened. Identities have become unstable. Economic change has eroded security. Technology has overwhelmed attention. In such an environment, people crave meaning, belonging, and direction. Religion, reinterpreted through modern lenses, became a refuge from emotional chaos. Yet this longing made individuals more vulnerable to manipulation. A populist leader, a charismatic preacher, or an online extremist could offer simple answers to complex questions. Faith, once shaped by tradition, now became shaped by fear, loneliness, and desperation. The fragmentation of religion in the modern world is not merely a theological story. It is a story about human psychology in an age of instability. God did not change. Spiritual truth did not change. But humanity's relationship with belief became more fragile, more desperate, more politicized. Interpretation multiplied not because divine revelation expanded, but because human anxiety expanded. One God became many interpretations because modernity produced many identities. Interpretations multiplied because institutions collapsed. Beliefs splintered because authority splintered. And amid this fragmentation, millions continued to fight over visions of God, shaped more by emotion and politics than by revelation. The modern world did not unify belief. It turned belief into a marketplace. And in this marketplace, the loudest voices, not the wisest ones, often prevail. To understand whether humanity can escape this cycle, we must now enter the final chapter, a journey into theology, psychology, and hope, to see whether truth can still survive in a world where interpretation has become infinite. 4. Beyond interpretation, can humanity escape the cycle of divine violence? For thousands of years, interpretations of God have shaped civilizations, forged identities, and justified violence. They have united tribes, created laws, launched empires, and inspired saints. Yet they have also weaponized fear, fueled holy wars, and turned neighbors into enemies. After centuries of doctrine transformed into ideology, and faith twisted into political machinery, the question remains, is humanity forever trapped in a cycle where divine truth becomes a battlefield? Or can we finally transcend the fragmentation, manipulation, and violence that have followed religion from its earliest days? To answer this, we must begin by acknowledging a truth that is as uncomfortable as it is liberating. Interpretations of God were never purely about God. They were about human beings facing uncertainty, mortality, suffering, and the overwhelming complexity of existence. Every holy text passed through human hands. Every doctrine was filtered through human minds. Every institution was shaped by human fears, desires, and ambitions. Divine revelation may be perfect, but human reception is not. And in this gap, between the divine and the human, violence was born. The cycle of divine violence begins when interpretation hardens into identity. Identity becomes boundary. Boundary becomes fear. Fear becomes hostility, and hostility becomes righteousness. This process is not unique to religion. It resides in the human psyche. We crave clarity in a chaotic world. We crave belonging in an indifferent universe. We crave certainty in the face of death. When a community declares that it alone understands God, it meets these psychological needs with forceful coherence. But coherence is not truth, and certainty is not holiness. Instead, they become fragile constructions that must be defended violently whenever doubt threatens them. The political world exploits this fragility with expert precision. Leaders know that nothing unites a population faster than a shared enemy. Nothing motivates loyalty more effectively than fear wrapped in sacred language. Nothing simplifies governance like a narrative that divides the world into us and them. As long as interpretations are tied to political survival, divine violence will continue, not because God commands it, but because power requires it. The use of religious identity in modern geopolitics, from the Middle East to South Asia, from Eastern Europe to the Americas, proves that the old machinery of manipulation is still very much alive. The battlefield simply expanded from deserts and temples to parliaments, digital platforms, and global media. Yet even as manipulation intensifies, something else is happening beneath the surface. Humanity is beginning to awaken to the illusion. More people today than ever before understand that interpretations are shaped by culture, psychology, and politics. The internet accelerates theological literacy. Philosophical inquiry spreads beyond universities. Religious studies become global. Interfaith dialogues increase. Historical context is no longer hidden behind institutional authority. A Christian can learn about Islam with one click. A Muslim can explore Jewish commentary instantly. A Jew can engage with Hindu philosophy without leaving the room. Knowledge has collapsed the distances that once sustained dogmatic certainty. This explosion of information creates tension. For some, it leads to deeper humility and empathy. For others, it triggers fear and pushes them further into fundamentalism. But the very existence of this tension marks a turning point in human religious history. We stand at the threshold of a transformation that earlier civilizations could never imagine. The possibility of understanding God beyond the prisons of interpretation. Breaking the cycle of divine violence requires a shift not in doctrine, but in consciousness. It demands that we recognize the difference between revelation and interpretation, between divine truth and human storytelling. When communities understand that their beliefs are shaped by historical context, cultural pressure, and psychological need, the sense of absolute superiority weakens. The walls that separate true believers from others begin to crack. A more mature faith emerges, one that is rooted in humility rather than certainty, compassion rather than conquest, curiosity rather than fear. But humility alone is not enough. To escape the cycle, we must confront the psychological mechanisms that make interpretation so volatile. Humans evolved in tribes. Tribal identity was essential for survival. But in the modern world, Tribal instincts are misdirected into religious, national, political, and ideological categories. When a religious interpretation becomes fused with tribal psychology, the result is explosive. It becomes not a belief, but a self-definition. Attacks on the belief feel like attacks on the self. This is why religious arguments escalate quickly. This is why communities defend their doctrines with the intensity of survival instinct. The only way out is to rewire this ancient mental pattern, to teach people that identity can be stable without being exclusionary, that faith can be strong without being violent, and that certainty is not a prerequisite for meaning. Theologies that embrace plurality can help. Many traditions already contain seeds of this wisdom. Jewish scholars emphasize debate as a path to truth, not a threat to it. Christian mystics found God in silence rather than doctrine. Islamic thinkers like Averroes and Rumi taught that diverse paths can reflect a single divine reality. Eastern traditions like Buddhism and Hinduism offer frameworks where truth is multifaceted, relational, and expansive. Every major tradition contains voices that challenge exclusivism and embrace unity, but these voices have often been overshadowed by the louder, more politically useful narratives of division. Escaping divine violence also requires confronting the power systems that benefit from religious fragmentation. History makes it clear that most so-called religious wars were not about theology. They were about land, control, and legitimacy. The 30 Years' War devastated Europe not because of doctrinal debate, but because princes used religion to justify political ambition. The Sunni-Shia conflict hardened not because of early theological disagreement, but because empires cemented sectarian differences to maintain influence. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict persists not because of irreconcilable religious claims, but because political and territorial realities reinforce narratives of divine mandate. The cure is not to erase religion, but to expose the political structures hiding behind it. Modern technology adds a new layer of complexity. Digital algorithms thrive on outrage, amplifying extremes rather than nuance. They elevate voices that weaponize fear and suppress voices that promote understanding. If humanity does not adapt to this digital battlefield, interpretation will continue to fragment at breathtaking speed. But awareness of the problem is the first step toward resisting it. Critical thinking, interfaith education, media literacy, and psychological resilience must become central to modern spiritual life. Without them, the cycle of divine violence will simply find new technological tools to sustain itself. The final question remains, is peace between religions truly possible? Or is humanity destined to fight forever over interpretations of God? The answer lies not in changing God, but in changing how we see God. Peace becomes possible the moment believers understand that no human interpretation can claim total truth. Faith becomes liberating when believers embrace mystery instead of demanding certainty. Compassion becomes natural when we view religious diversity not as a threat, but as evidence of humanity's shared longing for meaning. Violence becomes unnecessary when communities learn that love for God does not require hostility toward those who worship differently. To escape this cycle, humanity must reorient itself from exclusive truth to inclusive wisdom, from doctrinal rigidity to spiritual insight, from institutional authority to personal transformation. This does not mean abandoning tradition, but seeing tradition as a guide rather than a prison. It means recognizing that God, if He is truly infinite, cannot be contained in a single book, language, culture, or doctrine. He can only be approached through humility, compassion, and curiosity. In this light, the multiplicity of interpretations becomes not a tragedy, but a testament to the richness of human spirituality. Different traditions become different lenses for perceiving the same mystery. Different doctrines become different metaphors for expressing the same truth. Different rituals become different languages for speaking to the same divine presence. When humanity reaches this point, the idea of killing for God becomes not only impossible, it becomes inconceivable. But reaching this point requires a collective shift. It requires leaders who refuse to weaponize faith, institutions willing to confront their own history of violence, schools that teach not only facts, but wisdom, believers who value compassion more than certainty, societies that recognize that pluralism is not weakness, but strength, and individuals who understand that the divine does not need defenders, only witnesses. Perhaps the ultimate escape from the cycle of divine violence is not found in religion, politics, or philosophy, but in the simple recognition that the sacred is bigger than any one interpretation. When humanity embraces this truth, the battlefield dissolves, the walls crumble, the fear fades, and the God who has been buried under centuries of human conflict finally reemerges, not as a weapon, not as an ideology, but as a source of unity. One God, many interpretations, and maybe, finally, a future without victims.